Hi, I'm Tim and this is the Elusive Frame, a channel dedicated for photography and filmmaking. And today we're going to take a look at the exposure triangle, which is the basis of all photography and filmmaking. Basically any picture, photograph, video such as this one, or even a VCR tape, write down in the comments below if you actually know what a VCR tape is, were composed using the exposure triangle. Even your phone uses the exposure triangle to snap a photo. But in our phones it's something that we call an automatic mode, because when it comes to phone photography we just want to pull out our phone, snap a photograph and be done with it. We don't want to toggle any settings or learn anything new. We just want to capture what our eye sees, and our phone tries to capture it the best way it can. Our cameras, such as the one I'm using, also have automatic mode, but it also has a semi-automatic mode or even a full-on manual mode, which allows us a full control of the entire exposure triangle. This allows us to control the scene that we're seeing and compose not only what our eye sees, but what our minds think about. It all starts with our lenses. Each lens has a certain amount of blades. Open up all the way will allow light in, and closed all the way will allow no light in. We start with a certain opening, and from the moment that we press the shoot button, the blades start to close. During that period of time, from pressing the shoot button up to the time that the blades close completely, we collect a certain amount of light. This light is passed down to our camera, which reads it and processes it as an image. This duration of time between pressing the shoot button and the blades closing completely is called shutter speed, and it determines how much light our camera reads. It is measured by seconds and goes down in fractions, in my camera for example, all the way down to 1/4000th. It depends of course on the camera brand. How does it relate then to the real world? Well, if I'm trying to photograph my cat, which is by the way under the bed, I don't know if you could hear him, he's playing it very hard to get.
A few moments later.
If I'm trying to photograph him and I'm putting the shutter at, let's say, 2 seconds, the chances of the cat moving at these 2 seconds is very high. So what we'll get is his motion. His entire motion from the moment that we open the shutter up to the moment that it closes will be captured. And this is what we call motion blur. What happens then if we set the shutter speed at a lower number, let's say 1,000th of a second? Well, in that speed the cat is not fast enough, and what happens is that we capture it mid-movement as he goes for the stick. On the other hand, there are cases in which a high shutter speed is necessary. If I want to photograph the stars in the night sky above me, for example, I will need a shutter speed of at least 15 to 30 seconds to capture all the light from the distant stars. Or, if I want to photograph a waterfall or a river, let's say, I would want the water to look silky-like. And we can do that by putting a very high shutter speed and capturing their motion blur, which smooths out their movement, making them look silky-like. But I'm in the city and the light pollution here is severe and there are no waterfalls or rivers around me. So what I can do is photograph the light from moving cars. This photograph was taken with the shutter speed of 30 seconds and the camera was mounted on a tripod. Why a tripod, you ask? Well, I try to take the same photograph using my hands only, but no matter how stable your hands are, in 30 seconds the camera will record every shake, no matter how minor it is. Shutter speed eventually depends on the amount of light we have. Right now it's a very sunny day. Yeah, it's still very hot in here in October, and we can go as low as 3,000th of a second. But in places where there's no light or nearly complete darkness like this fine evening, we'll need to set the shutter for at least a few good seconds, and not my hands or anybody's hands are stable enough to hold the camera without shake for a few seconds. And we saw earlier what even a little bit of shake or motion blur at high shutter speeds can cause. This is where we can use the aperture to our advantage. Before we even press the shoot button, we need to set our blades at a certain opening. Open all the way will allow light in, and closed all the way will allow no light in. This opening before we press the shoot button is called aperture, and it is a second key factor to determine how much light can enter through our lens. It is measured by f-stops and according to industry standards in 2020 starts from f.7 all the way to f33. Now it's very important to remember because it's confusing. The lower the number, the bigger the opening and the more light enters. The higher the number, the smaller the opening is and the less light enters through our lens. Aperture size eventually affects how everything is sharp in a photo. Right now I'm at f2 and you can see the plant behind me and the light behind me aren't very sharp. But if I bump it up to, let's say, f8, everything is sharper. Very wide open apertures are used, for example, in portrait photography when you want to separate your foreground from your background, adding some nice bokeh behind you. But in landscape photography, where we want everything sharp to capture every little detail of that landscape, what we usually want is a very closed aperture so that everything will be sharp. Aperture and shutter speed always go hand in hand, because there's a balance to how much light can enter your camera. The shutter speed are the speed of the blades closing, while aperture is the opening in which we begin with. So, if for example I have a shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second and an aperture of, let's say, f33, then there won't be any light entering the lens because the blades close up very fast and the opening to begin with is very small. But on the other hand, if for example I have a shutter speed of 30 seconds and the aperture open wide at f2, then I'll have too much light and the image will be too bright because the blades will close very slowly and the opening will be very big to begin with. So we'll let a lot of light in and we won't get anything but a very bright photo. What happens if aperture and shutter speed aren't enough? Where I'm at right now, there's barely any light. So even if we put these two at their highest settings, we'll still get a horrible image because there's not enough light to read all the texture from the bushes behind me or from my face, for example. This is where ISO comes to our aid. When aperture and shutter aren't enough for the composition we want, and we don't have any external light source, like this window that the neighbor opened up and shining right on my face, we will set our ISO at a higher level. Before that the scene was very dark, so if I would set my ISO at a higher level, the image would brighten. But remember, there isn't enough light around us, so the details won't come out of magic, because these are the parts that the sensor can't read because there isn't any light in there. These two images were taken in different light conditions. The left image was taken in the evening, with the ISO set all the way up to 25,600 because there wasn't any light, while the right one was taken on a very sunny bright day, with an ISO of just 100. And that's why usually ISO is kept last at the exposure triangle, because we don't want to introduce noise to our images. It depends, of course, on how high the ISO level is, but it's usually recommended to keep it very, very low. So, when you take a photograph next time, ask yourself the next questions. Do I want my subjects to be frozen in time? Or do I want to capture their movement sort of blurry, like cars or fast-moving subjects? If the answer is yes to one of these, then you can put shutter speed at a higher priority. Do I want everything tech sharp like a landscape photograph, for example? Or do I want just myself or a certain object with a cool bokeh behind me? If the answer is yes, then you can put your aperture at a higher degree. ISO will be the key determinant when you don't have enough light. Usually try to keep it low because, as we said before, the details of our photographs come from light, and when there's no light, there's no magic. If you crank the ISO up, you'll only introduce noise to your images. And this is what we call the exposure triangle. Unlike the automatic mode of your cameras or your phone, tuning in each and every one of these can compose a scene just like you want. And you can capture not what your mind sees, but what your mind thinks. The exposure triangle might seem like a very hard thing, but once you get the basics nailed down, it only gets easier from them. What I would recommend is setting the pillars of the exposure triangle, the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO to their highest levels, and their lowest levels, and play with the combinations in between. Each one of these extremes in the photographs will reveal to you what each and every one does, and will give you a basic idea of how to use each and one of these pillars to your advantage. Remember, it's all about the process, not about the quality of the photographs. Just experiment until you actually have an understanding. If you liked the video, put a like. Subscribe to the Elusive Frame for more filmmaking and photography videos. I've been Tim, and I'll see you on the next one. Go out there and photograph. In manual mode. Good luck.